Welcome, folks, now to the lecture Loom and Auction Block American Women in the Factories and the Fields, 1790 to 1860. All right, this is our lecture now that follows on the age of the American Revolution. It represents the 7 decades or so that follow the Revolution and the writing of the Constitution, and which defined the period usually referred to as the early American Republic and antebellum eras. This is when America, in effect, becomes an independent nation, a nation of great territorial growth and steady population growth, in which the economy transforms from what had been essentially a commercial port economy during the colonial era and farming economy, including cash farming in the Chesapeake and Carolinas, now to the early Industrial Revolution, in which not only will the cash farming, the cash crop plantation agriculture explode across the greater South, particularly with the Cotton Revolution, but also the beginning of manufacturing in the early Industrial Revolution, especially, as we'll see, the rise of America's first factories. So a lot going on economically, culturally, geographically in the United States during these formative years following the American Revolution. In fact, it was following the War of 1812 and America's seemingly final resolution of outstanding claims with England that the country began to look inward to the potential for material development and the growth of market connections. America's treaty with Great Britain following the war opened the door for Western expansion and the rise of new cities connected to the Western trade routes, connecting the interior of the Mississippi Basin with the Atlantic seaboard. This is the period now in which such familiar American cities throughout the Great Lakes region in particular as Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Chicago, Illinois, and as you see here, Detroit, Michigan, really become the seedbed of a new industrial era in American history. Historians refer to this period of the early Industrial Revolution, as the Market Revolution. And it was a market revolution that would integrate the far spaces of America's growing landscape. Looking at the map, you see what had been the Atlantic coastal region of colonial America from New England down to Georgia, hemmed on the west by the Appalachian Mountain Range and on the east by the Atlantic coastline. That original colonial territory, now part of an independent United States of America, will begin to fill in the spaces that Great Britain had won from France in the French and Indian War decades earlier. So through independence now, those western places here in the Ohio Valley, here in what was then the southwest of the Mississippi Basin and the Gulf of Mexico, to now the beginning of a trans-Mississippi expansion into the Missouri territories and beyond, will become the new geographical imprint of the American nation. And one is tempted to see this, I think, as the beginnings of an American empire of North America, having only won independence from England in the 1770s and 1780s from the great empire known as Great Britain. The Americans will set about, in effect, developing their own landed empire across a broad reach now of North America. And it is this expanding market revolution that fuels this growth, demanding that what had always been local and home based manufacturing become more systematized. That is, you'll recall during the revolution what had been the homespun movement, that is, the traditional ways of spinning and weaving and sewing, and small scale manufacture were rooted in a home based economy. That traditional economy now give way to new cottage industries where women were paid for the work they had done, always done at home within the family, as seamstresses and sewers, etc., now finding work increasingly outside the home and producing for others outside the family as well, for what is increasingly becoming a market transaction of production for a larger market of people. Now, motivated by opportunities for land and wealth in the West, and again, keeping in mind the West at this point, the Ohio Valley region, the Mississippi Basin region, motivated by opportunities for land and wealth, Americans embraced a belief in progress. Listen to Senator Henry Clay and publisher Hezekiah Niles describe this almost religious enthusiasm for progress, the almost universal ambition to get forward, is how Niles described the defining attitude of the era. According to Senator Henry Clay, it is a passion as unconquerable as any with which nature has endowed us. You may attempt to regulate it, he says, but you cannot destroy it. Here's a photograph of Cincinnati, Ohio in the 1840s from along the riverfront, and it's such a lovely representation of the changes that we're describing, because not only do you have a great sort of manufacturing and storefront establishment arising now along the Ohio River, but also the great steamboats are lining up at the wharves to trade for the manufactured goods and agricultural produce, which they will carry down the Ohio River to the Mississippi, all the way to the Gulf of New Orleans. In effect, the entire interior of the country is connected now by a system of rivers and canals and ports, which are made accessible through internal improvements, and in the process establishing a vast new interconnected market. And somewhere in the mix of all this was a growing worship of what would become the great machine technology that fuels the Industrial Revolution. America's first factory, established in 1814 at Waltham, Massachusetts. You see an artist's sketch here, a textile factory. And 20 years later, a new factory town in Massachusetts called Lowell. This is an artist's sketch of Lowell, Massachusetts, and the textile factories that began to pop up, not only in Waltham and Lowell, but other manufacturing towns dedicated to machine-driven textile production. So all you have to do is think back to the image of women sewing with the spinning wheels and the hand tools, to now see that vision transformed into a large-scale manufacturing process. By 1850, Lowell had 52 mills with more than 10,000 workers. This was the beginning of America's Industrial Revolution, and let's be clear, women were at its very center. Here's Edward Everett again giving voice to that faith and progress. It is the spirit of a free country which animates and gives energy to its labor, puts the mass in action, gives its motive and intensity, sends it off in new directions, subdues at its command all the powers of nature, and enlists in its service an army of machines that do all but think and talk. So there's Edward Everett, a famous orator of the 19th century, almost breathlessly singing the praises of the new factory system. And as you can see in this early sketch, again, unmistakably, the operators of the great textile machines were an army of women laborers. As the development of large and powerful machines made working at home impossible, that is, the technological revolution that attended the rise of machine spun, machine woven textiles, more room was needed than the average cottage or farmer's cottage could accommodate. And so private capital now being organized by lending institutions, by mercantile interests to develop the larger spaces, the great industrial spaces that we call factories that could accommodate these loud, clanking, belt-driven machines of the industrial age. And the identity of the nation and its revolutionary heritage, in effect, now merged with the great industrial revolution of its daily work and labor. And even liberty herself got a makeover in the guise of steam-powered production. We've seen images of Liberty, female Liberty, already up to this point, and here she is with her American shield and her staff with Liberty cap. But this time the background, as you'll notice, is a textile factory with the smoke pouring from the coal-fired chimneys. And so liberty and manufacturing now merge, in effect, into a new version of an American dream. Don't forget that the colonies that defeated England in the War of Independence were not industrial societies. These were colonial societies of small farmers and port towns and merchants and shopkeepers and shippers and laborers and the occasional planter or plantation owner. But really now young America is getting a kind of makeover in industrial terms, and from the beginning, the basic ethic was that this represented great progress, that liberty and progress went hand in hand. So to the factories women went, as we've suggested, where they became the first factory workers in American history. Sometimes we forget this and we think of the famous posters of World War II with Rosie the Riveter and the images of female wartime labor and women's empowerment. But the fact is that when those middle-class gals in World War II took the jobs that their men had left behind as they went off to war, as the middle-class gals got to the factories, what they would have understood very quickly is that women were already there. Women had always been at work in the factories of America. By the time of World War II, it most likely would have been, say, immigrant women. But nevertheless, the Industrial Revolution is quite unthinkable without the central laboring efforts of women, and I might throw in children, for the first several decades. And this was a global pattern. Industrialized women's work was on its way to becoming a global phenomenon and ushering in the modern age as we know it. This is the Tomioka silk factory now in Japan, which in the later 1800s will become Japan's version of the Lowell and Waltham mills of New England in America, and will propel Japan toward becoming a great industrial power in her own right. So we see it in England, we see it in America, but we also see it globally in places like Japan and the Middle East and elsewhere, where the factory system will take root. Women were at the forefront of this global industrial revolution, typically young farm girls whose families labored under the depressed conditions of subsistence farming, and who now opened the opportunity for supplementing, in effect, the family income by migrating to the factory towns and working in the factories and sending their wages back to the farmstead in an effort to make the family economy more sustainable. And note that in almost every instance, this transformation, this transition from farm to factory was encouraged and marketed by the capitalist interests behind the factories with the same patriotic and nationalistic overtones. Japanese state and textile companies depicted factory workers as performing a patriotic service to the nation. So, just as we saw Liberty bedecked with her American shield standing in front of a textile factory, so too in Japan, then, are these overtones of patriotism and nationalism key. Because not only then are these previously rural nations becoming industrialized and more urban, factory production driving the economic wheels, but they're also becoming more militarily ambitious. You think of America's westward expansion, you think of the United States Army with its cavalry, its railroads, conquering the West, in effect, from the native peoples. So too in Japan, then, a growing industrial interest supports an expanding military interest as well. From the farm home, then, to the factory home, these young women will find their way. The factory towns were supposed to be orderly, well supervised, and under the benevolent authority of paternalistic managers, thus preserving the unsullied virtue of its female worker. Keep in mind, I mean, these are young girls not yet married, out from under the eye of their parents and especially their father's supervision, living as single women in factory towns. And there was very quickly a stigma associated with such women. Would they would they fall without the supervision of the strong male patriarch? Would they become vagrant women or loose women? These were the concerns in what was a fairly conservative country. And so the capitalist backers of the factories did everything, did everything they could to assure the nervous parents and society that these women would be taken care of, if not by their fathers, then by the managers of the factory. That is a new set of patriarchal figures, one of whom was this man, Nathan Appleton, a merchant turned manufacturer who helped build one of America's first factory towns in Lowell, Massachusetts. Appleton hoped that Lowell, dedicated to machine-driven textile production, would serve as a model factory town, and from the beginning he sought to impose a kind of moral code on the whole operation. Young women would live in dormitories and be supervised by dorm maidens who would serve as sort of parental authorities in absentia of the actual parents. And then once the young girls went to the factory, it would be the mostly male managers and foremen who would provide that kind of supervision, ensuring the same moral standards be followed. You see here a broadside touting the regulations for the boarding houses of the Middlesex Company. The tenants of the boarding houses are not to board or permit any part of their houses to be occupied by any person except those in the employ of the company. So, treating the boarding houses like female dormitories with strict supervision. The doors must be closed at 10 o'clock, for example. Here, young and unmarried women, mostly farm girls, as I say, rural women from the economically depressed rural areas, would supplement the family income with wages while living in supervised boarding houses. Well, at least that was the plan, and that was the marketing strategy, you might say. And in Lowell, there was even a kind of locally produced magazine called the Lowell Offering that was published as a way of sort of advertising these virtues and these moral standards. It was touted that the Lowell Offering was written by the workers themselves, who bragged that the contrast in the character of our manufacturing population with that of Europe has been the admiration of most intelligent strangers. Oh, let's see, that's Nathan Appleton bragging about the moral standards of the New England textile factories. We haven't heard from the women yet. According to visiting English author and writer Charles Dickens, they were healthy in appearance and many remarkably so, and had the manners and deportment of young women, not of degraded brutes of burden. So there was a kind of uh, marketing, one might even say a kind of propaganda, that extolled the virtues of the young women in the employ of the factories so as to reassure the society at large that nothing, no standards had fallen, nothing illicit was going on, that these were young women being cared for. And that seemed to be the picture advocated by a young Sarah Bagley, who became an advocate for women's rights and one of the most important labor leaders in New England during the 1840s, who, when she first began writing for local publications like the Lowell Offering, sang the praises of the factory towns. And here's an excerpt from one of her writings. Oh, you can just pick out almost any spot. She says, another great source of pleasure is that by becoming operatives, that was the name for the female workers, we are too often enabled to assist aged parents who have become too infirm to provide for themselves. So it seemed to make the family stronger. And certainly here the image of Sarah in a kind of prim and proper Puritan cloak with a cross exemplifying her Christian virtues seemed to affirm Nathan Appleton's vision. But what we find over time is that the harsh realities of factory life, of mill life, could not so easily be ignored. Consider, for example, the way in which the laborers were organized into working shifts. Here you see a timetable of the Lowell Mills from 1853. It's a bell schedule, basically. First bell, morning bell, rings at 4:50 a.m. 4:50 a.m. Then, when you look at the Saturday evening bells, so the work week note here was 6 days a week, not 5 days a week, that started at 4:50 a.m. Evening bells 6:30 or 7 p.m. So from 4:30 to 7 p.m. at night, and then on Saturdays, the first bell ring again in the a.m. period, ringing early, but then continuing into the evening, and this is the evening schedule here, until 4:55, 5 o'clock, 5:30, etc. So a staggered throughout the year, September, October. So this is a schedule predicated on a 6-day week, 12 to 14-hour days, which fluctuates only mildly seasonally, and that was out of deference to the amount of daylight. Remember, this is still the age before electricity, so they were gaslit factories, and only so much light was available. So sometimes constrained by nature to shorten the working day. Nevertheless, the whole idea of scheduling, when you think these women came out of rural farming communities where nature's rhythm dictated how you worked, from the rise of the sun, the setting of the sun, the lengthening, the shortening of the day, a kind of natural rhythm now, to a structured rhythm. In fact, the factory owners really had no other model to base their work routines on than the military. So borrowing a kind of military precision with bells, for example, and a tightly structured regimen of reporting and working and leaving. This is what now commodifies time itself into an hourly rhythm of wage earning. So paid per the number of hours one worked rather than the amount of work one could do. So work could be sped up, and production increased, but one would not be paid more for that fact. paid only according to the hourly wage set forth. In vain do I try to soar in fancy and imagination above the dull reality around me, but beyond the roof of the factory I cannot rise. This by one anonymous Lowell mill worker from 1826. And that company magazine, the Lowell Offering, will become an increasingly, edgy, if not actually radical, source for the voices and thoughts of the women laborers themselves. That is, moving beyond the propaganda of Nathan Appleton and the factory owners. The Lowell women will increasingly find ways to give vent to their frustration, to their fatigue and exhaustion, the numbing of their senses. These factories were loud and dusty and dangerous, with exposed machine parts spinning at fairly high revolution at times. It was easy to get one's clothing or perhaps hair or fingers or appendages caught in the gearworks. So these mills were a challenging and frequently unhealthy environment for the individual workers. And that's what will prompt Sarah Bagley to change her rather romanticized view. Sarah Bagley's views were transformed by the demands of the market and the ruthless logic of the capitalists, which, after all, the logic of capital was to increase production and lower operating expenses. So wringing every possible ounce of production by discounting wages and that sort of thing, increasing the hours of work. That was the logic of capital, which seemed to cut against the grain of the women who worked there, their health, their well-being. In fact, wages were cut twice in the first decade of the Lowell factories. Workers were turned out twice in 1834 and 1836 due to labor strikes. That is, the young women will simply walk out and then be locked out of the factory for refusing to work under the conditions provided. Hours and production levels increase, prompting the organization of the Lowell Female Reform Association, one of America's first organized labor associations that will seek to give voice to the collective strength of the labor Lowell mill worker. And provide some kind of protection or hedge against the domineering and driving ethic for profit by the factory owners. And finally, the LFLRA will call for what was indeed a radical proposal at the time, a 10-hour day. That is, to reduce the number of hours for work in a day from 14 or 12 to 10 hours, the argument being that it would give give the laborers more time for their own souls, to cultivate the better angels of their nature, to educate themselves, to provide for a healthy release. And this, of course, was met with steadfast opposition. And it reminds me of the sort of thing today we see when some legislator or union will propose an increase in the minimum wage. You're sure to find capital and the representatives of capital always opposing that increase, and many of the same arguments used today as were used then. So some things never change, and what this is doing is creating the first sort of distinctive socioeconomic class divide in America. And that was not supposed to be the case. America was supposed to be the land of opportunity, the land of individual freedoms, in which everyone was roughly, every free person at least, was roughly equal to every other. But this is really truly the beginning of something like a kind of permanent class divide between the propertied and non-propertied interests of the American city and the industrial economy, and women are at the very leading edge of this. Here you see the residents of a Boots Mill boarding house from around 1880. So across the 19th century, this pattern will hold steady as America transforms itself into an industrial nation. But listen to Sarah Bagley's changing perspective. In a piece from 1845, roughly 20 years after the first piece we looked at, the title of this work was simply Voluntary? Question mark. Whenever I raise the point that it is immoral to shut us up in a close room 12 hours a day in the most monotonous and tedious of employment, I am told that we have come to the mills voluntarily and we can leave them when we will. Voluntary. Let us look a little at this remarkable form of human freedom. And so what Bagley does here is begins to peel back the layers of propaganda and marketing to show just how oppressive the conditions were in the Lowell factories for young women. And keep in mind by this point, with the strikes of the 1830s and the growing unrest by local New England women, the factory owners will turn toward a new available labor supply by the 1840s. That is an immigrant supply of poor migrating women from Ireland and elsewhere, coming almost penniless to this country and being quickly seized upon now as a kind of replacement labor force for the native-born women, because as immigrants they were more vulnerable, less liable to organize and to strike. And so we add into the mix now another thread, a key thread of American history, that of immigration. And it pays to remember here again from the beginning that immigrants were in this country as working people, not as burdens on the public treasury, but as working people without whose labor in this case, the Industrial Revolution simply could not have happened. So despite the anti-immigrant sentiments, the fear of immigrants, the dislike of immigrants, in this nation of immigrants that often informs our political debates, the simple fact is, beyond all the propaganda, beyond all the marketing and nonsense, generally nativist nonsense, is that immigrants are as essential, and women immigrants as essential to the development of this country and its accumulation of wealth as any other single demographic. And that fear that the behavior of factory women would somehow lessen them as as exemplars of female virtue was something now that did begin to turn back on the laborers of the factories. Women were being judged outside the proper to be judged outside the proper women's sphere, because proper women, it was said, would not leave the home to be employed, and the factory owners looked to other more obedient laborers, that is, to immigrant laborers. So increasingly there's an ethnic dimension to this, that immigrant women laborers were seen as somehow impure or less feminine, less virtuous than those middle-class, native-born white women who did not work in the factories. And you can see the percentages of immigrant mill workers from 1845 to 1860 really explodes from 8% to 60%, to almost two-thirds of the workforce made up of immigrant mill workers. The arrival of immigrant workers changed the experiment of paternal capitalism. Boarding houses were shut down, unions were outlawed, and wage earning itself increasingly seen as contrary to respectable femininity. So that wedge, that divide in America between the working class and the non-factory working, what usually was referred to as middle class, was ever more apparent, as was the wedge between immigrant and native born. These are issues that America still struggles with, and we saw in the last presidential election a gleeful exploitation of those divisions between native born and immigrant, between women of one class and women of another class. Exploiting those divisions politically has always been quite popular. And it assumed, therefore, that there was a proper sphere of women, not immigrants, not factory workers, certainly not enslaved women, but proper women, such as those of the South who were, again, moral exemplars of what was supposed to be the purity of Southern culture. And it was these women now in all their finery who might wear the fine cotton garments spun by their working class sisters in the New England mills. According to Marion Penny, an English teacher in Kentucky, the Lexington men treat their wives and females generally as if they were large babies, and if they had no right to possess mind or understanding. They will pass them by, giving them sweet candy and other sweets, supplying them also with dress. So seeing these women of the propertied classes as ornaments, as fashion ornaments to extol the virtues of the propertied classes, creating hymns and poems, all are lovely, all blossoms of heart and mind, all true to their natures as nature designates. So the beginning of a kind of popular culture of stereotyping supposedly female virtues, really setting one class of women against the other, holding up unrealistic standards of beauty and leisure and gentility, so that if a woman could not match those standards, a woman, an immigrant woman, a woman working in factory could not hope to attain those standards, she was made to feel lesser, made to feel less virtuous, less beautiful. So this kind of capitalizing on class differences, the building of cultural norms based on those class differences, is something that gains its traction now in the early industrial revolution and really divides women across social and ethnic and immigrant lines. And don't forget the looms of New England that spun the cotton from the southern plantations, where an entirely different class of women now proved just as essential to the economic system. And of course, we're talking about the growing population of enslaved women whose labor was equally indispensable to America's economic takeoff as the labor of the women in the Lowell factories. And so in part two of this lecture, we will take a close look now at the lives of enslaved American women and seek to understand, if we can, how their lived experiences and their labors formed part of the larger tapestry of American development in the 19th